And I was born in 1941, which puts me at 81 as we speak. And it was a very poor upbringing. Outside toilet, no running water, 2 up, 2 down, back-to-back terraced houses. There were still Jewish families there, but they were decreasing, and the Catholics were starting to move in, including my parents. I was an only child, although it's a very long story, which we really haven't got time to go into. My parents did adopt a boy and girl who became my brother and sister, but I was their only biological child. I grew up in the 40s, even by the standard of the 40s, very poor. And then my mother created one of this incredible economic miracle, because somehow she got me to a fee-paying school. Now, you got to remember, there was nobody in Albert Road was getting to the Leaving Cert. And lo and behold, here is little George Hook going to a fee-paying school. So I went to Pres at 7 and stayed there until I was 18 and did the Leaving Cert in Pres. I had extraordinary parents. Like, they were educated by the Cork City Library because they had left school at 14, 20 or 30 years previously. And they were inveterate readers. My mother, fiction. My father, nonfiction. And my father extraordinarily knew about games like cricket and rugby and all these things. So he used to bring me down to the marina, green space in Cork, and he would bowl to me for huge amounts of times, teaching me to be a cricket batsman, talking to me about rugby. And then I went to Pres, and of course, there's only one game in Pres, at that time, and it was rugby or else. And the New Zealanders have a great theory that the worst players become the best coaches. And I think I proved that theory because I wasn't a very good player. I only had one really fatal flaw, I think. I had an awful lot of talent, but I was a coward. So that was a bit of a problem. I think, looking back, to be honest, it was more lack of confidence than cowardice, to be honest. I didn't believe I was very good. And that made me a good coach because I understood lack of confidence in players. And I was certainly a far more successful coach than I was a player. In your introduction, you talked about some of the teams I coached, I also coached the Irish students. I was the first ever coach to the Irish women's team. So I spent an enormous time coaching. Actually, I wasn't a very good businessman. So while my business was going down the toilet, George was coaching rugby. So that's what I did. And then, because my business was going down the toilet, it was putting my marriage at risk. At one point, there was a possible eviction from the house, which is very difficult for my wife, who kept the show on the road. Like all good Germans, she was made of stern stuff, and she kept the show on the road. And suddenly, Hook gets a job. So I got my first real job at 54. And I was down in South Africa, which gives you an idea how irresponsible I was. I was down in South Africa for the 1995 World Cup, even though I didn't have the proverbial pot to urinate into. And I got a phone call from RTE. And they said, look, can you do about 5 minutes before the Ireland Wales game in Johannesburg by the swimming pool at the hotel with the great Fred Cogley? And I did 5 minutes. And it was very good. Now, that sounds immodest, but one of the things I am is like, I'm a perfectionist. So therefore, I didn't treat 5 minutes irreverently, if you like. I treated it as if it was very important. And it went out on RTE, who were clearly doing the match back in Ireland. And my great pal, sadly gone, Bill O'Herlihy, said, my gosh, he said, that's really good about me. So RTE rang me again, and then I got another gig with them, and I used to get 25 quid for doing a gig for RTE. And it wasn't the money, believe it or not, but like for the first time, Ingrid saw her husband actually getting paid. Do you know what I mean? So the significance of the £25 was actually very important. And then the Independent rang me up and said, listen, we saw you on television. Would you do a piece for us on the Sunday? So we did a piece for the Sunday, and I got £25 for that. So suddenly now I'm on 50 quid a week. I can't believe it. Like, and then things got better, and you'd be delighted to hear that RTE paid me a lot more than £25 in due course, as did the Independent. I used to have a very interesting relationship with a great guy called Einar Sulawan, who was the sports editor of the Independent. And we'd meet for coffee in the first week of the new year in Blackrock in a coffee shop. And he'd take a piece of paper out of his pocket, a crumpled up bit of paper, and he'd pass it over to me. And he'd say, that's how much I'm paying you per article this year. And I'd open the crumpled bit of paper and I'd say, done. And I never had a contract with the Independent, at all.
George, just curious on the USA sort of job in terms of how that opportunity came about for you. Were you living in the USA at the time, or was that an idea that you thought yourself, right, if I can go here and prove myself in a real developing sort of country in terms of USA that had big aspirations in terms of trying to get onto that global stage, if I can make them sort of successful, then that might boost my chances here at home, dare I say?
I mean, luck plays an incredible part in everybody's life. And I'm having my breakfast in the Tara Towers Hotel and in Mount Merion. And there are all these rugby players coming down for breakfast in their shirts, but they're Americans. And I said to one of them, what are you doing over here? And they said, we're over here on tour. So I said, have you got a coach? And they said, yeah. And they introduced me to the coach, who happened to be a New Zealander. And he said, well, look, would you take a couple of sessions with my guys? I said, I'd love to. And I was one of the first people to make coaching video tapes. And I had these video tapes, and I used to show them to them. And then he went back to America. He spoke to the American Union, and he said, why don't we get this guy Hook over for our national coaching conference in Kansas? So they invited me. I went over to the coaching conference. I was the kind of keynote speaker. And it was in the May, June time of the World Cup year of '87. And the US national coach was there, another New Zealander. And he came over to me and he said, will you come out for a drink? I went out for a drink. And he said, will you come down to Australia with us as my assistant coach? And I said, absolutely, right? And he said, well, we haven't really got any money. And I said, well, I haven't any money either, so that works. So I went down to Australia, and we played we played Japan first, and that was the vital match because obviously it meant the loser was going to be bottom of the table, and we beat Japan. And then we had a midweek match against Australia where we ran them relatively close, and then we ran out of gas by the time we played England. But Ron Mays, who was the New Zealand coach, never forgot me after that. And I had intermittent trips to America. And then he rang me up and he said, this is about 4 years later. And he said, look, he said, we're looking for a national director of rugby. Do you know anybody? And I said, I do, yeah, me. At this point, he goes, Hookie's business has gone sour and he's unemployed and he hasn't a dime. And so I abandoned my wife and children and I went to America to be national director of rugby for 4 years.
Wow. And George, obviously that's a journey for you as such, but I want to bring you on now to 1992. You're managing Connaught at the time, and you mentioned there about a narrow defeat to Munster, and you felt maybe that the Irish job at the time that was the right time for you to come in, maybe and maybe apply for that Irish job when Jerry Murphy got it. Do you still sort of look back in that time and just say, what if?
Yeah, Kieran Fitzgerald was the Irish coach, and he had originally been the Connaught coach, but he never coached Connaught for a day, because no sooner was he appointed coach to Connaught than he was appointed coach to Ireland. And then I took over from him at Connaught, and Eddie O'Sullivan was my assistant. And we did a super job with Connaught, I have to say. And Eddie was crucial. There's no doubt about that. Eddie was crucial. And we lost all 3 games. It was incredible. But we lost all 3 games by, I think, 10 points in total. Like 3 games in total, 10 points. Like my good friend, referee Owen Doyle, Ralph Keyes knocks the ball about 6 feet wide at the posts with a drop goal. And my good friend Owen Doyle gives him the drop goal, and they beat us by a point. Then we should have beaten Ulster. Anyway, look. But I think had we, and we could have so easily won the championship. I mean, instead of being bottom, we could have won the championship. I think if we had won the championship, I might have been the Irish coach. I couldn't have done it. I wasn't the right person to be the coach of the Irish national team. You know, I would have brought Eddie with me. It would have been a key, obviously.
That's very honest of you.
No, it's not. It's just being factual about it. Like, you know, I don't think I would have been the right guy for the Irish team. You know, I was very, very good with bad teams, if you know what I mean, like, or young teams. Like, I was very good with young people. And like, the Irish job would have been a different kind of job. And I don't think I would have been the right person for it. You know, so I mean, I think I was better off. The Connaught, I had 5 wonderful years at Connaught. I adored my time at Connaught. Like they were unbelievably good to me. You know, and every time I drive down to Galway now, I think of what the drive was like. You know, there was no motorway. And you were going through Maynooth and Leixlip and Loughrea and that. It's like it could take you an hour to get through Athlone, you know. And you had only 1 session before an Interpro on a Friday. And I'd be sitting there in the hotel and I'd be getting a phone call from a fella, George, we're stuck in Athlone, you know. It was a very different time. But like, I stand corrected, but I suspect like more Connacht players played for Ireland under Eddie and I than at any time before or even possibly since. I mean, it was Tom Clancy, you know, at Loosehead. Now, admittedly, then in the back line, like we put an Irish back line on the field, in the field, with Connacht, Jim Staples at full back, Connaught, Simon Gagan on the wing, Connaught, David Curtis in the centre. I'm not sure when Connaught last had three players on the Irish backline.
And I suppose, George, I just want to...
And Eric Elwood, four. Eric Elwood, he'll kill me for not remembering.
George, I remember seeing something on the front line there with Pat Kenny, and you opened up about talking about Connaught, but also there's financial bothers in terms of that, and the stress that it put you under. Was it a very, very stressful time? Was it a real sort of worry for you? Did your health take a knock during those sort of times? Was rugby an escapism from the harsh realities of normal life?
Well, like, if you say what kind of effect did it have me, if you think walking down Dunleary Pier and in the middle of the night and taking your clothes off and getting ready to dive in and end it all stressful, then it was stressful, okay? The other thing I'm really interested in is advice to young people, like schoolboys. I should never have gone into business. Do you know what I mean? Like, never. I was an appalling businessman. I spent 25 years in business, wasting my time, losing money hand over fist, borrowing money to keep the wolf from the door, having people knocking on my door, telling me, if you don't pay us on one famous occasion, two guys arrived with baseball bats and said, if you don't pay us, we're going to break your legs.
Wow.
Yeah, so and then luck is everything. Luck is everything. 54 years of age. I haven't got a cent. And I got a gig with RTE for 5 minutes, which I parlay into television, radio, and newspapers. Like, look. And when I talk to people, like, there are people actually who wouldn't recognize luck if it hit them in the gob. You know what I mean? The trick really is to assume that every day is your lucky day. Now, you don't know it's your lucky day, but if you assume every day might be, you prepare for it. So no matter how unimportant something seems, like Clare FM are ringing you up to do a broadcast, and you think, oh, this isn't very important, but you give it your absolute best shot, right? Then suddenly, because Clare FM and Jim Conlan are one of the most famous radio stations in the world, NBC in America pick it up and say, we've got to get this guy hook. You know what I mean? You just don't know. And you can't turn around and think, well, this is no good, I'm not going to do it. You must take everything as vitally important.
And I suppose, George, in terms of being a rugby analyst on TV, you had to comment an awful lot of the hard times through the 90s, when it was tough, really, for Irish rugby in the Six Nations. England and France were so rampant, and you to give out really harsh criticism, harsh sort of justice. And it's, as people might know, it's not all the glory days we see now, beating New Zealand and beating Australia and South Africa. That wasn't the norm during the 90s. There was days when we went away to Scotland, we couldn't win for love or money, or Wales used to come here to Ireland and give us a fair thumping sometimes during the 90s as well, so there were some real tough times before the noughties came in. Was that very hard for you to really dish out that sort of criticism about your own sort of country sort of players, or you just basically said, I'm just going to call what I see before me? If it's useless, I have to say it's useless.
That's a very good question. And there are two sides to it, really. The first gig I ever did in studio, Bill O'Herlihy was the chairman, and O'Herlihy, after the thing, it was Ireland Wales, I remember. O'Herlihy said to me, and it was the best piece of advice I ever got. O'Herlihy said to me, he said, George, 75% of the people who watch sport on television don't understand it. Talk to the 75%, not the 25%. And I took that on board. So therefore, the first thing in terms of what I did, I tried to talk in a language that everybody could understand. So therefore, I didn't sort of say, well, now, John Hayes's right foot is 35 degrees off the parallel, and that's why the scrum is wheeling to the right. We never did that. I tried to talk about the game in a language that everybody understood. The other thing was, there was an advantage to starting at age 54. There was a definite advantage. If I'd have started at 30, I might have started very differently. But if I was going to get sacked, it wasn't the end of the world. I was just going back to being poor again. So what difference did it make? But I also had for somebody who didn't have confidence, I had a lot of confidence in that job. And I knew I was right. I was right that John Hayes couldn't scrummage. I was right, and I was right that, certain players weren't very good at what they did, but I had the confidence to know I was right and stand up for it. But the thing that you had to put aside was that if you were criticizing somebody, you had to suddenly understand, this guy has a mother, or this guy has a wife, or this guy has children. But you couldn't allow that to affect you. You had to just say it as it was. And the other huge difference was that the people I was working with were unbelievable, like McGurk, Pope, and for a huge amount of time, Connaught. We weren't great friends. That was the interesting thing. We didn't go for pints of stout or anything like that. But there was a great professional regard for each other. So we never tried to upstage somebody or whatever. It was a great experience for me, I must say. And RTE, RTE takes a hammering on a fairly regular basis, But RTE sport at that point, in my view, was the best sports programming in the world, right? Where would you get Spillane and Brolly in Gaelic games? Where would you get Giles and Dunphy in soccer, right? And then eventually you got Hook and Pope and McGurk in rugby.
George, just come in there. Do you think it's gone ages now when you look at it? Because Johnny Giles obviously let go, and probably still an awful lot to offer Johnny in terms of that off the ball. You see people gone. Is RT taking a twist now? Do you feel that maybe it's a bit ageist that anyone over 60 or 65 is sort of frowned on now in terms of giving analyst or advice? Do you start to?
Well, the first thing is pretty certain that a 54-year-old George Hook wouldn't get a job with RTE today. It has changed. I'm not saying it's better, or I'm not saying it's worse. It's different. So in order to be an analyst on television now, you must be a former international. So the only people who are on the panel are former internationals. We didn't have a cap between us, apart from Conor We didn't have a cap between us, So, and RTE never told us what to say, ever. They never said, no, hold on here, George, we want you to tone it down a bit here, or we want to, never. They let us go. And I think that was extraordinary. I must say they deserve incredible credit. Now, what has happened is the world has changed, radio and television generally have changed, not just rugby. It's much harder to call, as people would say, to call it as it is. It's much harder to do that now, and therefore people are much more reluctant to do it. Every word you say is sort of parsed and listened to. The other problem, I think, and I think it's a problem for the lads who are the analysts, is, it goes back to your question about me talking about players. It's very hard for them to talk about players they had played with. I think that's very hard. Like how I mean, there was an extraordinary situation on Virgin when literally the week after he stopped being the Irish fullback, you got to help me out here. My 81-year-old brain has
Carney, is it?
Carney, yeah. Carney was the analyst the week after he stopped being the fullback, and he now had to talk about the guy who was replacing him. And in my view, the guy who replaced him wasn't near as good. So, like, it needed somebody to say, you know, this guy isn't any good. But like, I felt incredible sympathy for Carney. You know, now what I don't do is, when I watch the games, I don't watch the analysis before halftime or afterwards.
Okay.
Not that I think it's worse or anything like that, but I know I'd be there and I'd be saying, oh, you should say this and you should say that. If you only